Welcome. This is Laura Ciceri. I want to welcome you to our webinar. This is part of our monthly webinar series. We've been doing these for 5 years. We share all of our slides and all of our research openly, and we invite a panelist for the webinars so that we can have a dialogue. Today, I'm pleased that Greg Schlegel has joined us. Greg is the founder of the Risk Management Consortia. Greg, welcome, and tell the group a little bit about yourself.
You bet. Thanks a lot, Laura. It's indeed a pleasure to be here with you to chat today about our passion, supply chain risk management. For those of you on the call, Laura and I go back, way back to my IBM days and Laura's days at AMR. The consortia is about 22 companies bringing tools, techniques, and solutions to support our vision of supply chain risk management. We also teach supply chain risk management at Lehigh University and ERM, Enterprise Risk Management, at Villanova. I've spent about 7 years with IBM when I met Laura as a supply chain executive consultant, and about 30 some odd years as a supply chain practitioner, perhaps like many of you on the call, for a couple of Fortune 100 manufacturers. I've also been past president of the Apex organization. Back to you, Laura.
Hey, thank you so much, Greg. Well, we're going to have a dialogue as we go along. In the study, we define supply chain risk management as the proactive identification and assessment of potential risks to the supply chain, as well as the development of strategies to avoid these risks. So one of the things I'm going to do today is share insights from a recent quantitative study that we did. We used LinkedIn as a panel, so we know who's in our panel group. And what we did was we are really looking at how we define risk, what are the drivers and disruptions, and the risk management performance. The average size of companies was 4.9 billion, and 60% of the companies were in the Americas, 40% were in Europe. So as we look at risk management, you can see that 18% of companies see risk management as a business pain, not very high. And most have embedded risk management into their existing processes. They've averaged 3.5 disruptions in 2017. It's interesting, we've done a similar study for 3 years, and we see that the number of risk disruptions have not changed. But we also see that risk as a disruption pain point has not really increased. Most people do not measure risk as a significant business pain. And it's interesting to me because I think many times we say risk management, but we don't really take the action that we need to. Now, the risk portfolio is changing. 38% a year, 5 years ago would say that supplier viability and visibility were their major risk issues. Today it's complexity of operations, and then we're moving into shifts in power and regulatory compliance. 74% say it's important to supply chain strategy, 50% rate themselves very highly, and 64% believe they perform much better than 5 years ago. I'm not so sure about performing better because we are not seeing the improvement in the level of disruptions. And when you look at the risk factors of the ability to do what-if analysis, efficiency at network design, buffer strategies, we don't see much improvement there as well. Greg, what's your perspective on this? Do you think we're performing better than we did 5 years ago?
I would say, as someone who's been working and teaching in this arena for about 6 or 7 years now, I would say yes, to a certain extent. We know of about 200 companies across multiple industries across the world who are what we call exemplar companies exercising supply chain risk management techniques, methodologies. So in that regard, about 5 years ago, we only knew of about 100. So in terms of exemplar companies who are doing many different good things in supply chain risk management. We think we've seen an increase in that arena, but overall, Laura, I would say we still set, our observation is about 70% of all manufacturing companies around the globe tend to do nothing in terms of supply chain risk management.
Well, except put it on a supply chain strategy document, right? I think we give it lip service. And I find that when companies outsource procurement or focus on only ERP standardization, that they tend to have higher risk issues because they lack the capability for inventory buffers, what if analysis, network design, collaboration with suppliers, the ability to know where second and third tier supplier relationships are. So I think many times companies are giving risk management more lip service than the actual results. So this is getting into the analysis now. You know, when you look at the overall business paying risk management rates low, I would question if, you know, we're just giving lip service to risk management. 65% of business users say it's embedded in other processes. When we ask, what does that mean? We don't get a good answer. You know, when we look at the vendor's perspective, because in this study we're contrasting business users and vendors, many times the vendors believe that companies are getting started and considering the options. So I agree with you, Greg, that we've got probably 200 companies, maybe a fourth of all public companies that are taking it seriously. And the companies that tend to take it more seriously are the companies that have had a major supply chain disruption or a major supplier with a supply chain disruption. And it's the focus of the leadership team, and it's maybe dictated by a major customer or a major competitor had a supply chain disruption, but there was a wake-up call. And when there's a wake-up call, there tends to be less lip service and more action. And when we look at the issues addressed by supply chain risk management, many times people are translating risk management into supply side risks. So supplier failure, natural disaster, external risk, or internal risk. But demand is a growing issue, and very few companies actually manage demand. So I was quoted in the Wall Street Journal about, you know, the increase in incoming goods into Long Beach, and, you know, the fact that all of our warehouses are full of inventory because of what's happening in tariffs. And one of the issues that I have is because we're so poor at demand, I think we've probably got the wrong stuff on ships and the wrong stuff in our warehouses, and we're trying to buffer because of the tariff situation. Most people will do pretty well on events, a natural disaster, but they struggle with the management of network-based effects, either demand or supply. Greg, your thoughts here?
I would agree with you 100%. In fact, what we've seen in 7 years, most folks begin their supply chain journey, if they buy into it, Laura, on the supply side, and that's understandable because they don't own that side of the business. All right, so it's fraught with risk, especially if you're procuring product from far off lands, geopolitical risk, and so forth. What is interesting, and you touched on it, is most folks don't think about demand side risks. And what we've seen over 6, 7 years by observation is that the frequency and the impact of demand side risks, meaning your customers, their customers, their DCs, their warehouses, though that frequency and impact is about the same, if not higher, than supply side risks.
Yeah, and, you know, Greg, if we look at, you know, some of the analysts that are talking about perhaps we'll see a recession in October and the rising cost of fuel, you know, it took 6 months for the supply chain to sense the downturn in the 2007 recession. And I don't think we've gotten any better. In fact, I think we've gotten worse because of item complexity and the fact that many times people implement demand planning systems, but they don't fine tune and they don't really understand the techniques of continuous improvement like forecast value add, and they don't know how to use channel data. So if we have a recession in October, I think it could even be worse than what we saw in 2007. So
I would agree with you. One, because of the uncertainty complexity, because we've all grown our supply chains globally since the last recession, and the issue that you highlighted, latency.
yeah, latency's increased, lumpy demand has increased, and I find that many times people have gone backwards on the use of their technology. So they implemented it and they think it's working well, but when you look at forecast value add, I've seen 20 to 15% negative forecast value add on existing technologies deployed. So it gets down to just really getting serious about A, risk, B, demand, and looking at how do we manage a network, not an enterprise. So when we look at the top risk drivers, this is 5 years ago versus the future 5 years, and these are line of business users only. The areas of decreasing risk are in green. So we are starting to make progress on supply chain visibility and viability and product quality. Operations complexity is growing as a risk, and this is because we're becoming more global and we're operating around the globe, and it's more complex. And also, demand volatility and economic uncertainty are growing as risk. Economic uncertainty, is just pouring out of the news every day, whether it's tariffs or uncertainty. I don't know if you saw the number of companies that posted negative earnings because of the issues with steel and aluminum, but economic uncertainty is growing. And then regulatory compliance is also an area of increasing risk, and globalization and geopolitics, which we're also seeing in spades. So, Greg, what's your perspective on this chart?
I believe you're spot on. I would reiterate, operations complexity, uncertainty, and risk is increasing again because we're all searching the globe for better raw materials, componentry, and so forth. Outsourcing is still going on. So I would agree, by our observations as well and our research, that you're pretty much spot on. What one encouraging side of the graph and observations, both on our side and yours, is that folks are getting, we believe, they're getting a little bit better in terms of their supply chain visibility, both upstream and downstream, especially the larger companies, the exemplars perhaps, who have the capability. There's still an issue and still a risk out there in terms of tier 2 and tier 3.
Yes. Now, when we look at the business users versus the supply chain vendors, um, the vendors are much more focused on supply chain visibility than they are increased complexity and demand volatility. So, what are you doing in the risk group that you work with to manage increased complexity in global operations? What techniques are you working on there, Greg?
Well, we advocate a lot of tactics. We have a lot of tactical methodologies that we advocate because we are continually growing our global supply chain footprint with all the nodes. You talked about network design. I don't think that's going to reverse in the next 5 years. We don't think so. So what we're doing with operations and supply chain folks when we get in and identify, assess, and help them mitigate and manage their supply chain risks, we also advocate things like SKU rationalization, evaluating your SKUs, not only with the classical ABC analysis, but exemplar companies are starting to evaluate their stock keeping units in terms of risk and putting together heat maps by SKU in terms of supplier vulnerability, sole source, single source. within their entire pipeline. So we advocate SKU rationalization. We advocate customer segmentation because we tend to treat all our customers the same, and that's leaving a lot of money and a lot of risk on the table. And then we actually advocate something called TCS, total contract or total control of your supply chain, where you start to plot your customers and your product portfolio, and then begin to rationalize, because we're very good at managing supply chain. We as a profession, we're not very good at deleting SKUs, getting rid of and throwing out non-performing SKUs and non-performing customers. And we think it's good supply chain performance and also good risk mitigation.
Yes. So when we look at supply chain disruptions, which this would be something that happened that caused an outage, each company reported 4 on average, and 41% were included in financial reporting. So it can be material. And Greg, you're so right that many times it's, whether a company is going to make it or not, right? Aerosol, which is a shoe company, which struggled with a supplier, which forced it into bankruptcy, is now closed its doors and shuttered many of its retail stores because of supplier issues. I was with a healthcare group that was talking about Baxter and the small IV bags. And I remember when I was in Puerto Rico 4 years ago, and people were sitting around saying, yeah, move pharmaceutical and medical device to Puerto Rico. We haven't had a hurricane in 15 years. Well, when Hurricane Maria rolled through, I think, U.S. hospitals didn't realize that a third of the pharmaceutical and many of the medical device supplies actually were in Puerto Rico. So, when we have a disruption, it's usually a wake-up call, but it's also something that can really be brutal on the company's viability. Your thoughts here?
I would agree with that. 2 statistics that we have come to embrace is, on average, a supply chain disruption has been calculated to equal about $350,000 to $400,000 per US per event. And a real sobering number to reinforce your little caselet, a real sobering number is from the insurance industries who are insuring manufacturers around the globe. If you experience a moderate to severe supply chain disruption like Hurricane Maria, 20 to 30% of all the companies affected will go out of business within 24 to 36 months. Very sobering.
And so when you think about it, Greg, many times people are kind of, giving lip service to risk. And I remember this conference so well because, everybody, did a high five about saving money because of taxation, favorable policies in Puerto Rico, and went to, have drinks and celebrate. And I was just sitting there going, with this kind of mass of healthcare and what's going to be a hurricane region, how can we celebrate? But I was, in the minority, but it ended up being an issue. Now, what were the top 3 events? So from 2013 to 2018, when we asked business users to report on the major events, we're having some pretty severe cyber attacks, computer hacking. I work with 3 companies that had significant outages where they couldn't ship goods because of computer hacking. The West Coast port slowdown continues to be an issue. I think it'll become even worse this year because of the uncertainty because of tariffs. Hurricane Harvey was also, but then we have Brexit with what's going to happen there and regulations on trucks, and then we've got what's going to happen with the shifts in the oil prices that are expected this year. Hurricane Irma, So these were the most severe disruption impact our drivers. Greg, any surprises here?
Actually, not really, Laura. I mean, I think we all agree now, we've all come to the conclusion that when your IT system is down for whatever reason, our supply chains are down. We don't take orders anymore over the phone and on paper. So that that is prevalent, and there's more and more organizations, companies placing bets to develop more and more heavy lifting and capabilities in that arena. Because when your IT system's down, your supply chain's down, and that's time. And a risk event is time and money. The others, all pretty good. I mean, that's a good profile of strategic, tactical, and operational risks. I would say one caveat, the issue is not all risks are the same. That's why you have to go through either quantitative or qualitative methods to assess those risks, because not all risks are the same.
Right. So when we think about this and we think about business continuity, most people have very solid plans for business continuity for events like hurricanes, but not necessarily for cyber events or for the ports or for, economic uncertainty. So, Greg, how do people prepare for this, or what's the recommendation that you have for people to be able to mitigate some of these risks?
What we see, and we would recommend it for folks, for anyone who's listening, is scenario planning using digital modeling. More and more companies, especially the exemplars, are digitizing their supply chain. That means put all of your supply chain, all the nodes, the connections, they digitize all the nodes in their supply chain, and then they run modeling to do what if. So the exemplars do it on a regular basis now, and we keep advocating to anyone who will listen that even perhaps using the SCORE model, using S&OP frameworks, essentially S&OP is a great framework and forum to do this, but the issue is inside out and outside in scenario planning. What if? All right. And then the reason, the big aha you get from that is you find out how your global supply chain will react to certain stimuli. And sometimes it's intuitive and sometimes it's counterintuitive. And then you can build, once you identify all those scenarios, what if scenarios, impacts, financial, append risk to it, Laura, then we advocate developing, as you said, business continuity plans, or what we would call risk response plans. If this thing happens, then who's going to do what, when, where, how, what are the numbers? That's a risk response plan.
However, Greg, what we see is only a third of companies have the ability to do what if analysis, and many times people confuse that an order is a representative indicator of demand and don't really understand channel demand, don't have the ability to do any outside in modeling. And, so one of the things that I recommend is that companies invest in what if analysis, design, buffer inventory types of technologies, and invest in people to be able to manage that. But I find that many times people that don't understand planning and don't build career paths for planners and don't have strong centers of excellence don't know how to get started in that. Any tips or techniques that you would have for the audience?
I would agree with that 110%. The sobering tip is, and you've seen it, Laura, and so do we, is culture drives everything in an organization. All right. If culture, if you don't have the right culture in your organization, and you have a certain culture that is perhaps risk averse, you are going to wait until you have a risk event. There's all kinds in the bell-shaped curve, but the tip is you can do scenario planning on a whiteboard in a conference room manually. You can do that using Delphi techniques, to go around the room. We teach that in all of our workshops, in all of our classes, in terms of how the process of how to go about doing brainstorming, which is really what if scenario planning without some heavy lifting tools. It is possible to do that.
It is, but it requires work, and particularly if companies have outsourced procurement and don't have any understanding of their supply network, it's hard for them to even do a whiteboard. But one of the things we find is business users rate their performance on risk management higher than that of other companies, so they believe they're doing a good job, but their competitors are not. And the technologists believe that the business users are not doing as good a job as they think they should. So one of the issues is the gap in understanding of the technologists and the fact that business users feel pretty good about what they're doing until they have a problem, and then it's like, oh. And this is one of the issues is that, we talk about visibility, and visibility means a lot of different things to different people. And we find that in a disruption, 67% of companies have visibility to first tier suppliers, 37% have visibility of the assets, but only 37% have some visibility, and this is some visibility to the extended network of suppliers. This could be second or third tier suppliers. So often people don't even know where their second and third tier suppliers are, where their manufacturing and distribution centers are. So the companies that I see that are doing a good job have supplier development programs where they actually deploy people to the sites in the case of an event, and they try to help the sites to become, more robust following an event and drive business continuity. The companies that don't do so well find out that a part didn't arrive and their line went down. And so if you think about the horrible issues that happened in Japan, when the storms hit Japan, Intel had people, they dispatched 9 people to keep all of their fabs up. In contrast, Ford shut down its production line and was surprised that one of its fasteners was actually produced in Japan, and that was a couple of weeks later. So, we find a big discrepancy here in knowledge of who the suppliers are, where their manufacturing sites are, and visibility to second and third tier suppliers. Greg, your thoughts here?
Yep. No argument, Laura. We see the same thing. It is encouraging. I think over the last 5 years, the ability to have visibility to your first tiers has increased. It's gotten better. But even the exemplars, Laura, the folks like IBM and Flextronics and Nokia and Ericsson, who do everything that we advocate and more, one thing that really still keeps them up at night in their complex supply chains, which are really networks around the globe, one thing keeps them up is the cascading cause and effect of a tier 1 disruption to tier 2 to tier 3 to the medium componentry contractor. They still don't, even the exemplars still don't feel very comfortable in terms of being able to manage and mitigate that cascading disruption throughout their complex networks.
So the other thing is, when companies are doing well, they not only monitor the status, but also the financial health through supplier development programs. And if we look in the study, first tier suppliers, 62% have any visibility of the first tier, and 40% have some visibility of tier 2 and tier 3. And this is monitoring financial health and tying to supplier development of how can they help. One of the things that I see is that we've actually got a lot of issues in procurement. We've extended payments, we've outsourced. Only a third of companies have supplier development programs, and many of them don't know how to go about this work of sensing supplier health and having programs that actually help the suppliers. But in the case of business continuity, it's really essential to have these supplier development programs and to include supplier development in with business continuity and contingency plans. So the most important risk techniques are building these continuity plans, doing what if analysis, knowing what the network is, having conversations with suppliers and customers about risk management, understanding what they perceive as their risk, understanding what that risk does to your value network, supplier monitoring and scorecarding, which all is really paramount to managing the supply network. And then inventory buffers, push-pull decoupling points, staff awareness and training, manager and leadership insights, and then the ability to have flexibility and agility through things like different modes of transportation, currency hedging, etc. Insurance is really, just to ward off, risks from cost. But these are some of the tactics. So I know you do a lot of work in this area, Greg. What do you think are the most important tactics?
Well, I like the outcome of the chart. We would tend to agree with that. It's very encouraging again to us that the top four are there. Those are just almost like basic foundational elements that everyone should be doing in one way or the other. I like all three areas. Some are tactical, some are operational, some are strategic. But I would say this: what we see coming down in the future, in terms of what does the future look like, we suspect supply chain disruption insurance, not just hazard insurance, Laura, not just replacing the facility like we would buy mortgage insurance or home insurance, but there are now new tools out there by the insurance industry called supply chain disruption insurance, which will pay for certain expenses when your sales go to zero, when you have a risk event. Sales go to zero, costs continue to accumulate. And so essentially there are new techniques or new packages out there. So we suspect supply chain disruption insurance will rise. Social listening will rise. Some of the exemplar companies like IBM and Cisco and Flextronics and Nokia, they all take a look at social media. They scrub social media as best they can to see who's talking about their products from a brand reputation point of view, from a competition point of view, and they are starting to develop insights using predictive analytics, using cognitive computing to essentially place some bets and identify risk earlier and then mitigate that risk on an ongoing basis. So we think social listening is going to rise. Predictive analytics will probably move up the chart, and there'll be more and more new supply chain risk management software solutions coming on board in the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, we talk about listening, but we aren't real good at listening. We're better at yelling our message. I have a question here. Question is around demand-driven operations, which, there's a Demand-Driven Institute has been pushing demand-driven MRP, which has sort of co-opted demand-driven, being outside in and using demand signals from the channel, uses the order signal. And question is, does DDMRP reduce risk? Greg, your thoughts on this?
It's a good question, Laura. I'm not that adept, or I don't understand all the ins and outs of DDMRP. I suspect it may. I can't speak, definitively on that. But I will say this: there are several industries that are going through an unbelievable supply chain transformation from the old push supply chain to demand-driven pull. One industry is the retail apparel. There are companies like Zara and H&M who are turning the industry upside down, from one season where you order, procure, put it out on the shelf, place your bets, and hope people buy style, size, color with one season, to folks like Zara who are absolutely invoking all the tools and techniques and tricks of demand-driven voice of the customer supply chain and are pulling product through their supply chain and coming up with, Laura, some unbelievable cash conversion cycles. At last check, Zara's cash conversion cycle, which many of us might on the call might be using as a measure of effective supply chain, their cash conversion cycle is minus 45 days. The average of their competitors is 145 days. That is a huge strategic advantage.
Yeah, well, Zara's always had the ability to design for quick conversion. But, if we think about DDMRP, I mean, it does allow us push-pull decoupling points, does focus on buffer strategies. So that's positive. Lacks the what-if capability, often is not going far enough, I think, in the management of demand. And my fear is that it is becoming kind of overhyped and will go through the hype cycle. But there are some positive attributes around buffer strategies and push-pull decoupling points that help with that, because most people are really looking at safety stock, not form and function of inventory.
I
So
would agree.
yeah, so when we look at this, I think there's some positives, but it doesn't get us all the way there. So when we think about risk management, we talked about the fact that, the average company has 3 to 4 events. Many of them become financial events. Business leaders and technologists are not very well aligned. Most of the technologists are pumping out supply chain visibility tools, not really getting into the issues of operations complexity or the ability to better translate channel demand signals into the value network. Risk management is, I think, an essential practice. And, my concern is that current risk programs don't address future requirements because we're still not able to get into those second, third tiers, to know the location, to be able to monitor financial health, to be able to deploy supplier development programs, to manage demand outside in. I think instead what we're doing is we're basically automating the enterprise and focused on transactional thinking. So that's my concern. Greg, your thoughts?
I like the final slide. I agree with all three observations. I think it's time to wake up. I would say that we still have a lot of work to do, but we're encouraged because we do about 35 workshops around the globe a year. So I think we've touched on it several times, Laura. It's education, education, education. Many folks don't think overtly during their day in operation and supply chain about risk and what the impacts are. So with our book out there doing well, with our workshops educating, we still need a lot of education and awareness. I wouldn't argue with your premise about vendors. It's encouraging that the vendors are placing bets, Laura. More and more vendors are coming out. Solution providers are placing their bets in the area called supply chain risk, like supplier assessments, like demand planning and scenario planning, with digital modeling, in terms of complex supply chains. So it's very encouraging to us, but there will continue to be, like you said, wake-up calls when people, by culture, I'm not saying by design, but by culture, tend to say we haven't had anything happen in the last 3 years, ergo we're pretty good, we're pretty smart, and boom, you get a risk event that you may or may not survive.
There's a question Greg Irvin asked. While Laura mentions that she thinks most companies are not focusing very much on risk management as practice, wouldn't you say that evolving operations processes or incorporating risk management more? For instance, don't we have it really built into the strategy?
It's a good question. In certain instances, I would say yes. Because now think of it. If you're a big company or a company who is big on and has bought into Lean Six Sigma, what are those? Those are performance enhancing techniques and methodologies, but also Six Sigma, and Lean, to a certain extent, they are risk mitigation. I'll give you, for instance, if you have what we call chronic risks, and all of us have them in our supply chains. Chronic risks, the definition is they are very high in frequency. They happen 10 times a shift in your supply chain. Why don't we fix them? Because the financial impact is so insignificant, we build what we call workarounds, all right? And we don't fix them. Sooner or later, chronic risks can manifest themselves in a supply chain to equal what we call acute risks. That's when your system goes down. That's when your work table goes down, your workbench goes down, your plant goes down. That's within the four walls that you say you can control. So we have an issue in supply chain called chronic risks. And, if in fact you exercise Lean and Six Sigma, those teams will find those chronic risks and argue that those risks should be fixed. Now, that's a form of risk identification, assessment, and mitigation. I don't know if I answered the question.
Well, I think you did. There are lots of practices, whether it's demand driven or risk or, you know, lean, that help to improve buffer strategies.
Mhm.
I think that putting it all together, though, requires design, what if analysis, outside in, type of process management, network planning. And what I see is most people are still arguing about IT standardization, outsourcing and procurement, not using channel data. And so they're sort of like sitting ducks. And I would like to think, Greg, that more and more companies are becoming exemplary companies in risk management, but I don't see it. You know, good for you that you're seeing it. But anyway, let's wrap up. I want to encourage people to register for the Supply Chain Insights Global Summit. This is going to happen in September, September 4th through the 7th. It's in Philadelphia. The event is designed to help people to drive digital innovation. We start with blockchain, Internet of Things, cognitive computing use cases. Then we look at some bespoke research we've done on quantitative analysis to financial balance sheets to look at what choices people have made that drive the most results. And we'll have, lots of technologists there that will be able to look at, imagine the supply chain, whether it's cognitive or drones or robots, to help people to look at future use of technology. Then the next day is very focused on how do we define digital, how do we drive digital innovation through processes. We have many companies are going to talk about organizational design for digital innovation. So how do we make the digital pivot? What do those design for organization principles look like? And then we'll get into tactics. So Laura Bismeyer from Corning will be talking about the use of software robots for procurement and digital procurement. And Nick Lynch will talk about his work on demand translation and demand driven. We have a person from Merck, Barath, who will be talking about schema and read and the movement of cognitive computing into visibility. And we have Murad from Schneider and Sandeep from Mars, who'll be talking about digital innovation. So we've got a very full agenda, and then we've got Philippe Lambat, who'll be talking about how do organizations differ in their ability to drive digital innovation and to drive change. Philippe is now at J&J. He was at General Foods Kraft, and then he was at Mattel for a while. So he's going to talk about the differences of organizations. The event is designed for extreme networking. There are no sponsorships. We do have a digital showcase, and it's a time for supply chain leaders to really question what they're doing, to learn from the past, to unlearn, to rethink the future of supply chain. So, Greg, let's wrap up. If you had to say what three things should people do differently about risk, what would you recommend?
I'd say go through an analysis in however you would like to do it to identify the risks in your supply chain. Then once you've identified those risks, go through and begin to assess those risks. And then once you've assessed them and you've agreed, prioritize them in descending order by highest to lowest, and pick a few that you can essentially manage and mitigate and attempt to mitigate the top risks on a continuous basis. Identify, assess, mitigate, manage.
Yeah, I think that, as we think about risk management, I like your idea of a heat map, Greg, to look at items. And I would go through all the items and all the materials and ask the question, do we know where it's sourced? Do we know the risk? Have we looked at demand volatility and economic uncertainty for these items? And I like the idea of the risk heat map. I also like the idea of building horizontal processes, social listening to revenue management, to sales and operations planning, to corporate social responsibility and supplier development, to look at, how do we manage across the functions so that we just don't have one function. And I don't believe that, just saying that we've embedded it in other processes serves the need. I think that risk for 2019 is going to be higher. Port infrastructure issues are higher. We see the economists starting to talk about potential downturns in the economy. We see the potential of rising oil prices with what's happening and the shifts of crude that are going to be mandated for ocean liners. And, we've seen an awful lot of economic uncertainty in the last year. So I think it's going to become worse, not better. And our ability to model, to have supply chain planners who are good at their jobs, who have the tools, and leaders that believe in optimization and data-driven analysis is really the key. So Greg, thank you very much for attending. And again, we will archive this, and we will be publishing a report on risk management. We encourage you to use all of our data openly. We share openly. And thank you for joining us today.